Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining us for session 4 of the US-Australia Indo-Pacific Conversation Series titled Advancing the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, Successes and Challenges Ahead. We would like to give the floor to today's moderator, Ms. Sharon Feist, Command Gender Advisor at US Indo-Pacific Command, to kick off today's program. Over to you, Sharon.
Aloha and thank you, Ariel. Ikomamai, welcome everyone. My name is Sharon Feist and I'm the Command Gender Advisor at US Indo-Pacific Command and lead the Office of Women, Peace and Security. And I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of Pacific Forum, welcome to the 4th session of the United States Australia Indo-Pacific Conversation Series. This virtual dialogue series is organized in partnership with the United States Study Center, University of Sydney, and is supported by the US Department of State through the US Embassy in Canberra. In the last session of this series, we heard American and Australian experts discuss the Pacific Islands region and some of the ways that their countries have worked with Pacific partners to address pressing concerns related to development and climate change, and more recently, the complications imposed by COVID-19. Our other regional actors, including China, have played a more active role in the Pacific Islands of late, further complicating the strategic challenges of great power competition. So today's session, titled Advancing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, Successes and Challenges Ahead, will also draw on this perspective to unpack the role that gender plays in security issues and how it can be employed as a smart power capability. Now, while this certainly offers a competitive edge to states who operationalize the Women, Peace and Security, or WPS mandate, it is essential to understand the ramifications of not doing so. And to help us examine these issues further, we are joined today by two prominent voices in the WPS field, Dr. Joan Johnson-Fries of the US Naval War College and Dr. Jackie True of Monash University. So for a brief introduction to our speakers, Dr. Joan Johnson-Fries is a professor of National Security Affairs and the Charles F. Bolden Jr. Chair of Science, Space, and Technology at the US Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. She is also an adjunct professor at Harvard Extension and summer schools, where she teaches classes on women, peace and security, space and security, grand strategy, and US national security, and leadership in war and peace. She is the author of multiple nonfiction books and articles, a featured speaker at numerous national and international events, and an experienced media consultant. Her most recent books are Women, Peace and Security, an Introduction, Space Warfare in the 21st Century, and Educating America's Military. Joining Joan today is Dr. Jackie True, and she is a professor of international relations and director of Monash University's Center for Gender, Peace, and Security. She's an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and a Global Fellow with the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. She is a prolific author, and her book, The Political Economy of Violence Against Women, has won numerous international awards, including the American Political Science Association's Biennial Prize for Best Book in Human Rights, as well as the Australian Political Science Association's Carol Pateman Book Prize for Gender and Politics. She recently edited the volume Scandalous Economics, The Politics of Gender and Financial Crisis with Ida Hozick, and is co-editor with Sarah Davies of the Oxford Handbook on Women, Peace and Security. Dr. True most recently authored Violence Against Women, What Everyone Needs to Know. And I'm also pleased to announce today that Joan and Jackie have collaborated on an article in the lead up to this webinar, and that was published today in Pacific Forum's working paper series, Issues and Insights, titled Women, Peace and Security, A Competitive Edge for Australia and the US in the Indo-Pacific. You can find the link to that article in the chat box now. Before I turn it over the floor to our speakers, just a couple disclaimers. The views expressed by the speakers and myself as a moderator do not necessarily reflect the views and official positions of the US government, including the US Department of State, US Department of Defense, or the US Embassy in Canberra. All views and opinions expressed in this webinar also do not necessarily reflect the positions of Pacific Forum or of the speaker's home institutions. And finally, all remarks, including those during the question and answer portion, are on the record and will be shared on Pacific Forum's YouTube channel following this session. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over now to our American guest speaker, Dr. Joan Johnson-Fries. Over to you, Joan.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you, Pacific Forum, for having me with you for me this evening, for you morning or afternoon. And it's such a pleasure to work with Dr. Chu on this important topic and to co-author that paper with her. I have found in doing presentations from Reading, Pennsylvania to Addis Ababa that it's always first good to give a little bit of background on women, peace, and security to kind of level the playing field, because people either tend to know a lot about it or not much about it. So just to make sure everybody is on the same platform, the Women, Peace, and Security framework dates back to work by human rights activists in the 80s, and certainly came to the forefront in 1995 when Hillary Clinton in Beijing very famously said, women's rights are human rights. Because prior to that, it was more or less discovered that a lot of people didn't consider women's rights as part of human rights treaties and conventions. From there, in the year 2000, the United Nations passed Security Council Resolution 1325, which made the very important link between gender equality and security. And I can't say that enough, and I can't put enough importance on that gender equality certainly is a human rights issue, but it's also a security issue. And getting people to understand that is, I think, key to acceptance of the Women, Peace, and Security framework. Increasingly, skeptics, and there are some, are convinced by data. And increasingly there is data which verifies this link between gender equality and security. Dr. Valerie Hudson has done some of the key work in this area, and her latest co-authored book puts out some statistics that I think are pretty impressive. I want to share a couple of them with you. If your nation scores high on gender inequality, you're more than twice as likely to have a chance of being a fragile state. If your nation scores high on gender inequality, you're more than 3.5 times as likely to have a government that is more autocratic, more corrupt, less effective, and more than 1.5 times the chance of being violent and unstable. So we're beginning to present the data to show this very important link. The data that's perhaps most often cited is that when women participate in treaty negotiations, the chance that the agreement will last increases by 20%, that it will last for 2 years, and 35% that it will last for 15 years. But yet women are only included in peace negotiations about 10% of the time. They bring knowledge to the negotiation. They bring different concerns based often on their knowledge of different circumstances. They bring different communication styles and different problem-solving skills. So having women involved has been repeatedly shown and data shown to be beneficial. The Women, Peace, and Security framework is based on 4 pillars: protection, prevention, participation, and relief and recovery. And what this means is for women to participate, they need to feel safe coming out of their homes. They have to have the venues and the agencies to become involved. They need to, in fact, be dealt with in the after effects of war zones and instability, and they need to be involved in preventative measures. I like to kind of synthesize these 4 pillars into 2 parts. The first is inclusive diversity, meaning men, women, boys, girls. We need to have involvement of all genders. And I know one of the questions that's going to come up is, does having women, peace, and security really narrow the field? Should we have it bigger and have gender? And the answer is yes, and we can talk more about that later. But inclusive diversity means having people involved in a way that they feel that they're appreciated, they feel open to participating without fear of retribution of any kind, and they are valued. So inclusive diversity is one big part. The second is gendered perspectives, and that recognizes that policies and programs affect men, women, boys, and girls differently. and that we need to consider that when making these plans and programs. And two examples that point this out, one very simple: more women die in car accidents than men. And it's not because we're worse drivers, it's because the safety standards for cars are based on crash dummies that are built according to men's body types, which are bigger than women. So the safety features of cars aren't as protective. To take that and make it more security related in a broader way, in many countries, women are barred from participation due to structural barriers. Structural barriers are those based on laws or on policies. So in many countries, for example, even though women are the predominant agricultural workers, they can't own land. And when food aid is distributed, be it seed, fertilizer, tools, whatever, it's very often given to the landowners, who in many cases will just sell it on the black market rather than using it for the betterment of the crops. The Food and Agriculture Organization out of Rome estimates that if this food aid was distributed differently, if it was given on a kind of gendered perspective basis, that there could be more food produced, resulting in 100 to 150 million people being less hungry. So literally, gendered perspective saves lives. So here we are in 2021. The Women, Peace, and Security framework was passed 21 years ago now, and there's a couple ways to look at that. We can say it's still in its infancy. It's more or less where climate change was 30 or 40 years ago, with people saying there's a problem, but we don't have to deal with it now. And saying it's coming along, and it is, but we can also say it's been 21 years. Why is it that there are even awareness is still very low, even among security communities? I think that's a huge issue. And that is kind of where I have focused my work, is trying to just raise awareness about women, peace, and security, because I've been dumbfounded in more than one circumstance at the number of security practitioners, including some very high-level security practitioners, who have no idea what Women, Peace, and Security framework is even all about. And my view is you can't implement what you don't know about. So raising awareness, to me, is a very important first step. Some people do know about it and simply resist. And there are different reasons for resistance, many of them cultural, some of them structural, having a kind of benefit to keeping things the way they are. And that plays out in a lot of different ways. And sometimes it's just what we call blind fish. Blind fish is two goldfish swimming in a goldfish bowl, and one fish says to the other fish, "So what do you think of the water?" And the other fish says, "What's water?" If you don't know, if you aren't experienced discrimination, you might not recognize it, even though it's all around you. So I think a big part of advancing the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is, in fact, doing away with the blind fish, making sure that people are aware. And I think one very important way to do that is through education. Education, be it through State Department programs, through professional military education, and through academy education generally. I met with my last Women, Peace, and Security class at Harvard on last night. And one of my students raised the point that it was entirely possible to graduate from Harvard as a government major and never have heard of the Women, Peace, and Security framework, the idea of gendered perspectives, and the effects on policymaking. We've got to change that. We've got to change that across the board. And I think we need to look at that in the United States, domestically, and what we're doing abroad. And I must say that the Women, Peace, and Security framework from the US perspective traditionally has gotten more attention in Africa and Latin America than other places, but that is changing, and it's changing rapidly. And I'm very happy to see the work that's being done in the Indo-Pacific region. I used to be at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and was very pleased to learn that they have a Women, Peace, and Security program. Part of the resistance too is that it's questioning its relevance. I've had a lot of people say to me, well, Joan, Women, Peace, and Security was relevant in Iraq and Afghanistan when we were trying to win hearts and minds, but now we're in great power competition. And I would push back vigorously to that. Certainly, Women, Peace, and Security has a big role in human security, getting people out to vote, getting them involved in the economy, getting women and men working together in civil society. But in great power competition, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, I think implementing Women, Peace, and Security can give the United States and Australia a real edge. And I say that because I think great power competition is actually can be more characterized as great power parity. That what has happened is China and other countries in the region have advanced. And so the gaps between the United States, Australia, and other countries has narrowed. And I think that's to be expected. Nobody expected China to settle for what they considered a lower place on the power rung. So they have advanced militarily, technologically, economically. And so when you have this great power parity, it was written up in another journal, and one of my students said, they used the analogy of sports teams, that as sports teams get better, the gaps between them narrow and the wins are by fewer points. Teams don't win by 30 or 40 points or great margins. They win by much smaller margins. So to win by smaller margins, you have to take advantage of every benefit that you have. And the knowledge, the skills that 50% of your population bring cannot be ignored. And again, they bring them in ways that involve communication, problem-solving skills, knowledge, just concepts of how to frame questions. And that can give, I think, the United States and Australia a big edge, because especially in China, they don't have that gender inequality mandate that is evident in both Australia and the United States. Women are still banned from professions. Women are, again, still in many instances, second-class citizens. So we need to take that advantage that we have of recognizing what women can offer and put that to good use to our advantage. So I will stop with that and turn it over to Jackie.
Thank you so much, Joan. Handing it over to you, Jackie.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Joan. Tough act to follow, but hopefully I can sync with you. And thanks again to Pacific Forum for making this webinar possible. And because I'm Zooming from Australia and from Monash University, I'd just like to acknowledge and pay my respects to traditional owners and elders, past, present, and emerging, and the land and waters on which Monash University is located. So I share some of Joan's skepticism about the degree of awareness and relevance of women, peace, and security. But I do think with more than 2 decades now since Resolution 1325 was adopted in the UN Security Council, that women's roles, in particular in peace and security, have been highlighted as crucial to national security and global stability, and that has never been more important. Those roles have never been more important than today in the Indo-Pacific region. And I'd like to say a few things with regard to the region and why I think women, peace, and security is so important. But just to back up Joan with her comments and explanation of the women, peace, and security agenda, that it is not a niche agenda for women. And that's a common misconception. It is a security agenda, as well as a gender equality agenda, as well as a human rights agenda. But I strongly believe and have seen through the research we have done in the Monash Gender, Peace and Security Centre that integrating gender equality perspectives actually enables governments and people to better prevent, prepare for and respond to armed conflict and to other crises. So it's extremely important, relevant and strategic agenda. Now, when we look at Australia and the US support for women, peace and security, that support is incredibly central in the Indo-Pacific region, and including defence cooperation, but also development aid and diplomacy that's focused on gender equality. And both of these dimensions are really, as Joan has mentioned, counterpoints to China's influence in the region and China's growing influence in the region. And I think that women, peace and security, that lens and that approach to cooperation has allowed both the US and Australia to support Pacific-led security and development. And that's really important. And if we look at, for example, Australian foreign policy, over the last decade or so, the single largest investment in gender equality was in the Pacific Women Shaping Development Program. And that was instigated initially through the partnership between the US and Australia under the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, and our former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. And now just last week, we have seen that program further extended by Minister Maurice Payne with a new title, Pacific Women Lead, but I think also reflecting the changing regional security situation and that women, peace and security is really central to Australia's Pacific Step Up. And to the need to really, I think, draw on two main advantages of the women, peace and security agenda in maintaining security. And that is firstly, to really harness the potentials of both women and men, especially in the security sector, but also within civil society, to protect and prevent against insecurity and violence. And also to be those frontline agents preventing climate change and responding to natural disasters. And secondly, I think the advantage of women, peace and security in the region is really building the capacity of security and peacemaking professionals to be able to respond to different threat scenarios. And not just the traditional security threats that we're most familiar with, and as we have our standard operating practices in regard to, and there I speak to the threat, the interstate threats, the threat of China as a rising great power, but also other threat scenarios that are really relevant to human security and that may not register in the great power competition, but that are increasingly, affecting everyday security of people. And there I refer to things like radicalization to violence in the, the spread of violent extremist groups in the region, including the threat of female radicalization to violence, which has been so underestimated by so many governments and security organizations, but also, and one of the reasons why those threats are underestimated is in part because of the gender biases and other biases within the way in which we think about security and threats to security. So I think, with regard to those two advantages, really like harnessing all of your population to deliver and be responsible for security, and also being sure that you're actually attentive to all the potential threats to security. And I think with regard to those two advantages, we can see in the region with support of the US and Australia that the Southeast Asian states, as well as the Pacific Islands countries, are increasingly recognizing this reality. So with ASEAN, we have seen Indonesia on the UN Security Council and now Vietnam, and the overall Southeast Asian region and the 10 countries in that region are seeking to maintain their security, and definitely in that broader context of great power competition and the rising global power of China. And so I think here we can see, already some change in mindsets in ASEAN already this year, and recognizing, that the advantages of women, peace and security. So in March, a regional study on women, peace and security in ASEAN was launched. And for the first time, ASEAN leaders agreed to the recommendation in that report to create a regional action plan on women, peace and security. So we hope to see much more focus on gender equality and women's roles in the security sector, and also really, key attention to a range of human security threats as well. So in terms of what Joan was mentioning about women, peace and security being an advantage to widen the thin margin of excellence and to maintain security in the region, on the part of Australia and the US, I definitely think that, yes, gender hierarchy and gender norms are one of the fault lines, increasingly one of the fault lines in the competition between and among states. In global politics generally, and in the region. But having said that, I think that the equality and in particular the women's participation and leadership in peace and security that's promoted by Women, Peace and Security is also important for conflict prevention and for societal non-military sources of sustaining peace. So this morning I was reading, for example, in the journal Foreign Policy about Australia's current engagement with China, and some of the tensions in that relationship. And it was pointed out in that article that China is playing a long game with regard to security and with regard to their territorial power. And what I would say is that women, peace and security is a long game as well. And that part of the long game is also focusing on building those sources of conflict prevention from the bottom up in the region, in communities, and that means empowering women and empowering communities. And I think there, sort of as part of a dual strategy, both in terms of stepping up defence cooperation, but also stepping up support to empowerment, I think then we can expect to see women, peace and security really achieving that thin margin of excellence. So just an example there would say that research finds, and our research at Monash Gender, Peace and Security Centre contributes to this research, that women and men with hostile attitudes toward women and towards gender equality in general are not just, they are more prone to extremist views, but they're also more likely to actually support violent groups and to participate in political violence. So that, sort of sexist views are effectively priming you for political violence and instability. And we've actually found this in Indonesia, in Philippines, in Bangladesh, and colleagues have found it in Thailand based on their research there. And so then, building the strong support for gender equality and human rights is actually really important for building support for non-violence and commitments to conflict resolution. And an advantage of women, peace and security is that it addresses the structural gender inequality and these kind of sexist norms, discriminatory gender norms that are, frequently barriers to sustaining peace, and especially in fragile contexts, but in general. So if we look to the region at the moment, where we can, a lot of eyes are on Myanmar and the current fragility and violence in that country, and we can also see, the young women on the street defending democracy and human rights and playing a central role, protesting against a regime. And often, many of those women are also protesting that regime based on their own experiences of systematic sexual assaults by the Tatmadaw military. So here, women, peace and security perspective also really focuses our attention on women's agency, and women's agency not only in the security sector, but in civil society. And as those people on the front lines, really trying to build the foundations for peace. So I think there are a number of challenges to advancing this perspective on women, peace and security in the region. Many states in the region, for example, and many individuals and possibly security leaders as well, misconceive it as a women's agenda, a kind of to put it in a common American aphorism, a kind of motherhood and apple pie agenda. And as I've written with a colleague, Anche Vina, everyone wants a piece of this. How can you be against women, peace and security? It sounds like a good thing. But unfortunately, we need to go beyond that to actually, implement key actions to level out that playing field for women in particular. And I think another misconception of the agenda is that it's an agenda that's only relevant if you're a country or a community engaged in armed conflict or active conflict. And that's obviously not the case. And women, peace and security can make a difference to the protection and security for all, even at the community level. So I think, unfortunately, these misconceptions means the agenda fails often to gain sufficient traction among policymakers and also to be translated into key actions and resources to support them. So at the same time, we have seen traction in Australia and the US. And certainly in Australia, we've seen on the part of the of Defence and the Australian Defence Force a desire to be a world leader in implementing the military aspects of women, peace and security, and a national action plan from 2012 through to 2018 that really drove progress in the recruitment, retention and promotion of women in defence roles. But again, that's only part of the agenda, because we can't actually promote stability and peace through military capabilities alone. We also need to challenge the gender stereotypes and blind spots in security responses. And as Joan has mentioned, countries with more gender equal structures are overall less violent and more peaceful, both in terms of state sanctioned violence against women, but also in terms of state engagement and war and conflict. So we've got to cultivate those gender equal structures and norms. And that requires significant support, again, for women's empowerment, community empowerment through development aid, partnership and diplomacy. At present, Australia has just launched its second National Action Plan with 4 major outcomes for the next 10 years. It is a long game. And the third outcome really focuses on supporting resilience in crisis and security, and especially to meet the needs and rights of all women. Now, here I think really important to highlight is the other gender dynamics of violent extremism, which at present I don't think are well covered or understood, either in the women, peace and security agenda or necessarily in this second Australian NAP. We have seen in the region that women can be radicalised like men, but in distinct ways. And we can see that if women's agency and grievances are ignored, they will join violent groups too. And we are seeing this throughout Southeast Asia. And so this kind of widening of the reach of terrorism, we can expect to have and continue to have destabilizing impacts on the security of the region. So a gender-based analysis of violent extremism threats is probably, I would say, one of the areas that needs the most attention right now. And I think it is connected to great power competition, because certainly it's undermining the stability of states in the region. And I think another real resistance we can see is to enhancing women's roles in the security sector. So, you know, I think that there is a lack of consideration of how women can be agents of security rather than merely victims of security. And possibly as a result of the gender imbalance in militaries in the region, there are significant protection gaps, especially regarding gender-based violence and the use of sexualized gender-based violence in fragile situations as part of a war fighting tactic. I think frequently in the region, we fall back on familiar assumptions, and there's resistance to challenging gender hierarchies and to seeing women as leaders, as well as agents of security. And there's also resistance to increasing the role of civil societies in their responses to security, especially with regard to prevention of violent extremism and so on. So just to sum up, I think that the US and Australia's national action plans on women, peace and security are really important. Both countries have shown key leadership, but this leadership has got to be translated now into partnership with allies in the region. And this is where the rubber meets the road, basically. And I'd like to see both countries really continuing to commit to enhancing the capacity of the security sector organisations to respond to gendered insecurities and risks. The Australian Defence Update in 2020 mentions threats to human security, but nothing about women, peace and security in particular. I'd like to see greater efforts to support gender inclusive military and peacekeeping forces and really support to Southeast Asian countries in recruiting, retaining and promoting women and seeing some increasing women leaders in this sector. And finally, I think Joan also made this point about women, peace and security also needs to extend to really stepping up our development aid and support for the inclusion and empowerment of women to improve livelihoods and sustain peace from the bottom up. So thank you very much. I'm greatly looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And thank you to both of our speakers for sharing your keen insights and expertise with us today. But I would add particularly for your tireless efforts in championing the Women, Peace and Security agenda and framework, particularly among defense and security practitioners. Your work has been incredibly valuable and influential, and I can personally attest to this as a gender advisor working with the US military. So thank you to both. So having heard from both of our speakers, in a couple of minutes, I'll turn to our audience for their questions. And we have a little under 30 minutes remaining today. The instructions for Q&A should be flashing on your screen. And just to recap, to ask a question and or to comment, please use the raise hand function located on the tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please wait to be called on and unmuted by Pacific Forum staff before speaking. Please also state your name, position, and affiliation before commenting or asking questions. Alternatively, you can also submit your question through the Q&A tab, but if you utilize this option, please also include again your name and affiliation in your submission. So to quickly just jumpstart this conversation and kind of this rich conversation, I'm going to first ask a first pre-submitted question, and this is addressed to both of you. So in your opinion, how far advanced is the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the Indo-Pacific region as compared to elsewhere? And are there lessons to be learned from other regions that could be applied to further promote WPS in the Indo-Pacific theater? Perhaps, Jackie, do you want to start with this one and then we'll move over to Joan?
Absolutely. I think that the Indo-Pacific region is underappreciated at the global level in the global women, peace and security agenda. So possibly it's sometimes thought, what can we learn from other regions? But I'd like to turn that around and say, what can other regions actually learn from some of the developments in the Indo-Pacific region? Because I think there are some positive lessons, and there's a lot happening on women, peace and security on the ground in communities in this region. So just to highlight the fact that Indonesia has developed a national action plan on preventing violent extremism that explicitly mentions women, peace and security, and has key mechanisms for involving women leaders and women leaders of civil society organizations in the prevention work and in some of the coordination with government around the response. I think this is world leading. And I would like to see other countries in the region kind of really, adopting some similar approaches. And the Philippines has also, taken steps there as well. So I think that's really great, because we're starting to see the mainstreaming of women, peace and security into other security agendas. I also would draw attention to the fact that we've had some key champions of women, peace and security in the region. So obviously not only the foreign ministers of both our countries, but here the Indonesian foreign minister, Retno Marsudi, the foreign minister of South Korea, and Vietnam has really been taking a leadership role while on the Security Council as well, and convened a global conference last year. So I think, there is the leadership necessary to further drive this agenda. I think that the security issues in the region are really complex because it is the site of this great power competition, right? It is the region where we have, that kind of systemic tension. At the same time, we have huge human security challenges with regard to the impacts of climate change and the island countries and communities that are really threatened by rising sea levels, droughts, and flooding. So, these are key threats. And then we also have, really complex ethnic, religious diversity that's also, means that there are ongoing, intercommunal tensions. And, we are seeing that right now with the failure of the peace process in Myanmar. So the complexity of the challenges, I think, makes this region quite distinctive. And these security challenges are, really at all levels, from the interstate to the intrastate to the community level. So having said that, I do think that, what we need now is to be able to really promote diffusion and learning within the region, and try to distill some of the lessons from conflict prevention within countries, to share those more broadly, and try to build up the security leadership within Southeast Asia and within the Pacific, and even between those two sub-regions, really sharing and supporting one another. And then that kind of cooperation through women, peace and security could actually bolster the ability to prevent future security threats.
I would just tag on to that. When Jackie's talking, I sit here and nod my head vigorously, agreeing with all that's being said. But I would like to point out that in the United States, in 2017, we passed the Women, Peace and Security Act on a bipartisan basis, making implementation the law of the land. But again, it's taking these words and turning them into implementation. That's the kind of the rough road. But there has been a recognition since the Obama administration that the Indo-Pacific region is the region of the future. It's the region where conflict will start or where conflict can be prevented. And I am convinced that the Biden administration is going to work very hard to match domestic policy and foreign policy. It is very committed to gender equality within the administration. We've seen that already. And I think we are going to see increasingly the lessons learned that the US has learned in Africa and in Latin America will be transferred to the Indo-Pacific region. And the US-Australia relationship is such that working together, there is a lot of progress that can be made. And I think, again, I have if I could be queen for a day, I would have women, peace, and security put into the US national security strategy, because that would make things happen. But I am convinced, again, individual leaders see the benefits of implementation as again, not just a nice thing to do if we can get there, but it's having real stability implications that that benefit everyone. So I'm optimistic for the future of taking, again, these lessons that we've learned, that Australia has learned in the region, that we've learned elsewhere, and can really turn this into an effective program. And I have to point out, from a US perspective, the gender advisors, Sharon, my hat's off to you. The work that you do is so important in keeping leadership informed of again, gendered perspectives, gendered policy, and the work that needs to be done in the region. We need a lot more gender advisors, and we have to have the money available for that kind of training.
Excellent points. And thank you to both. Just like Joan, I've been emphatically nodding my head at pretty much everything you both have been saying. So we have actually a series of questions that have come in. I'm going to kind of combine the first two because it is related to China. And both of you touched upon this in your paper that was released in the Issues and Insights by Pacific Forum. So the question is, it's kind of a combo question. First, has Chinese economic influence in Australia been abated? And then correspondingly, what is the gender equality, or what is the gender situation in China currently? There is no specific person this is addressed to, so I'll defer to Joan and Jackie on who wants to tackle these questions.
Jackie, I think you can talk to the Australia piece first.
Okay. You know, I mean, I think there is clearly some trade wars going on between China and Australia, kind of low level at this point, but I think they have significant implications for Australian security. And actually, it's really important to notice here how tied economic, you know, situations are to security situations. So, however, I mean, I think that there are obviously different ways to deal with this. And it's possibly not helpful to talk about war as your major response to that. So I think, you know, I think always Australia has kept its kind of trade policy somewhat distinct from its security policy as a way to manage that. And at present, those seem to be, you know, really conflicting and coming into under threat. So I think that, you know, that having said that, I think, you know, many Australians greatly benefit from trade with China. We have a significant Chinese presence in the country. We have very good social and cultural relations. And, you know, I would say in my classroom at Monash University, and when I teach gender, peace and security issues, I'm very happy to have Chinese students zooming in because they can't come into our country at the moment due to COVID. So I think, you know, we have, you know, some really good relationships there, and I think we are committed to maintaining those. And it's really important to put those areas on which we don't agree, you know, into one, you know, into one area, and really also try to focus on, you know, the positive aspects of the relationship and the mutual benefits of the relationship. And in terms of, you know, I think it's really interesting, the students from China are very interested in women, peace and security. And they really want to use these frameworks to analyze and explore the gender inequalities and the challenges that they are experiencing as young women in China in various industries. So I think as Joan and I highlight in the paper, despite the fact that Chinese socialism has historically been linked to gender equality, in recent years, ironically, as China has sought to engage much more with the global market, they have have taken their eye off that gender equality, and the women have been losing jobs and discriminated against and face a range of different abuses which have not been addressed in that country. So we've seen declining gender inequality and the rise of quite significant patriarchal norms. So I think my role as a teacher, an educator and a researcher is also to support those really progressive social forces in China, to bring a strong gender perspective and a strong peace and security perspective into their own institutions and contexts.
I would add another point that we raised in the paper, that China is an example of problems you can get into by ignoring gender equality. When China instituted its one-child policy, that resulted in a real population imbalance between men and women due to practices in their society. Sons were favored, and you had instances of sex-selective abortions favoring male children and female infanticide, and basically a population imbalance that resulted in there being more men than women, and these men being unable to find wives and not being attached to families. The Chinese refer to these men as bare branches, and finding that these men who don't have the possibility of getting married and having families, being less attached to society and more prone to violence and destabilizing behavior, a situation they created for themselves. At the same time, they had a policy to raise education levels of the population in general, which resulted in more women getting educated. As Jackie said, more women in classes. They're very interested, they're very progressive. And so finding themselves educated, but now again, with the slip back to increasingly patriarchal norms, being shut out of workplaces, being discriminated against, being economically discriminated against, and all of this resulting in less, not more, domestic stability, which of course, as we all know, is a huge Chinese concern. So I think there was an unintended negative consequence to their one-child policy, which is now rearing its head today, and from this gender inequality.
Excellent points. Moving on to a question from Dr. Sharman Stone with Monash University. And oh, forgive me, the two prior questions was from Admiral Mackey, former SINCPAC commander, regarding the China questions. This question from Dr. Sharman Stone is, given that Indo-Asia in particular has seen millions of unskilled women migrating across borders and from rural to urban regions within country to become low-paid, frequently exploited and unregulated labor, what are the peace and security implications for the sending and receiving countries and for our often now stateless individuals?
Happy for you to answer that one, Joan, since Sharman is from my center.
Oh, I see. Well, we always know that when there is migration, when there is people moving away from their homeland, it is not a favorable situation. It's going to be causing hardships on the women that are moving. Very often they have little experience on being on their own. They are unskilled. Many of them are having children with them and are placed in situations where their security is at risk, using restroom facilities, being in environments where they are threatened with violence, often sexual violence. And then the receiving country, again, feels a certain burden that they are taking on populations not their own, which could be taking away from their job situation, that they will become low-income employees. And it is just overall a destabilizing situation, which is not good. I think it's always better to keep people where they are comfortable, but you have to create the conditions for them to be able to do so. And I think that's where the Women, Peace, and Security framework comes in, is being able to create situations where these women learn skills, where they, and not necessarily women related skills. We don't necessarily have to teach them how to use a sewing machine. Better to make them data processors, make them marketable. A lot of women I'm thinking of in Colombia, after the civil war there, found that they were being retrained in low-income fields, low-income, to be cooks, to be seamstresses. And they were saying, I have to feed a family. Train me in something that is marketable, where I can make a living wage. And I think, again, that's so important in the entire Indo-Pacific region, to get these kind of training programs involved. I was in Vietnam several years ago, and we were in an orphanage, and they were saying that if they could get a teacher in there to teach English, that the potential for those children, for their employment, goes up by immense measures, because they can work in tourism. They can work in industries where they can actually make a living wage. So I think those are the kind of things that we really need to focus on as preventative measures, so we don't get this destabilizing migration and going on.
Thank you for that, Joan. I'm going to combine two of these questions because they're revolved again around great power competition. The first one is from Alexandra Phelan, and she says, thank you for a fascinating conversation. There is an assumption in great power competition that we may see an increase in small wars within the Indo-Pacific region, and that will further exacerbate conflict and insecurities for women. I was wondering how the WPS agenda could potentially be further integrated into COIN, or counterinsurgency or stabilization strategies. And similarly, there was a question from Jonathan Lim talking about the intersections between gender equality, the WPS agenda, and information operations as elements of great power competition. So handing that over to you about kind of the balance within COIN, stabilization strategies, and also information operations.
Shall I go first, Joan?
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, great questions, and thanks so much. And I think, you know, both people who asked the questions could probably have a good go at answering them themselves. You know, with regard to the potential for small wars in the Indo-Pacific region, and how that, you know, might be prevented or responded to through a Women, Peace and Security framework. I think here, you know, what's already happening in some countries in the region with regard to really harnessing, you know, women's empowerment in communities and their involvement in preventing violent extremism is really relevant here. So the creation of national action plans that enable the government, the state, to kind of connect with key sort of sources of prevention within, you know, across community and civil society groups. I think this is really key. And why it is because if we think about, you know, COIN strategies, which, for example, the use of female engagement teams in Afghanistan and Iraq, and not necessarily having, you know, the success, quite the success that was intended there. I think also recognizing, you know, the kind of non-military side and the importance of prevention at the root. of the and I think this is where, really kind of activating, community-led groups and women's participation in those groups, and recognizing and supporting women's leadership at the community level is so important to preventing the kind of to enabling those groups to have good relationships with security organizations and with the government, so that they can report what's happening on the ground, or that at least they can have some kind of joint prevention initiatives, and this is what is being pushed for in those countries. This is incipient, and I think this kind of approach is going to be needed much more. And I think this is where we would see Australia and having strong bilateral relations with many of these countries, and has been supporting some of these initiatives. We can see really the importance of sustaining that, but also really diffusing that to other countries in the region. So, I mean, I also think that on the military side, this is where it becomes really important to be promoting more gender inclusive security sectors, and also really building the capacity of those security sectors to actually anticipate, a range of threats to security, at the local level and in different sites, and one, in a way that, that is really responsive to what's happening on the ground. So, if you think about, examples like the Marawi siege, and the failure to prevent that siege is a lot about the failure of the government to coordinate with civil society, and in particular women's community organizations.
I will just piggyback on Jackie's comments about the importance of civil society to say that women understand that chaos hits them first and hardest. They will do everything they can to prevent that if they have a voice that enables them to do that, if they have a structure that enables them to do that. And I think that's, again, where the Women, Peace and Security Framework and cooperation between countries like Australia and the United States can make a huge difference. Poverty doesn't create radicalization, but it certainly provides a petri dish. The more you can get in and build an economy, to build an environment that is stable, where you have healthcare, where you have education, where you have a community that people care about, it is less vulnerable to radicalization. So I think that's where we can do this preventive measures. But left to fester, an unstable society will become a venue for these opportunistic small wars. And I think, again, we can do a lot better to do it now. And prevention is always cheaper than dealing with it after the fact. So if you want to look at it from an economic perspective, better to spend the money now than spend it later when you're dealing with bullets and violence and chaos.
Mm-hmm. And Joan, just to add there, we understand the value of prevention in Australia with regard to COVID.
Oh, yes.
And if we just compare ourselves to the situation in India right now, or even in the US. So I think that, this prevention focused effort needs to be very much part of how we approach security.
Yeah.
Thank you to both. And I have, we have a raised hand, I believe from Cornelia. If you want to unmute yourself and proceed with your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so terrific. So I'm so delighted that you all are doing this. And with regard to diffusion and learning, two events, historical events I'd like for the two of you to focus on, or all three of you to focus on, that seems to be ignored is one, General MacArthur's women's emancipation policy for post-World War II occupied Japan. And then the second one is Bougainville, that used a WPS strategy, and that never gets highlighted. So it seems to me we need to look at things that have worked and why they have worked, and also learn from them to say, okay, but there were certain things that didn't work, and why didn't they learn? Why didn't they work? And what can we learn from them so that we can incorporate that for future endeavors? So I thank you all very much.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Cornelia. Having read John Dow's book on embracing defeat, on the US occupation of Japan and how it also brought emancipation of women, I think that's a fascinating case to think about, and how integral is women's empowerment to the promotion of democracy, and to the promotion of security, which I think is what we're trying to emphasize here. With regard to Bougainville, I have actually myself written on this, and I know other colleagues have too, and this some of the key initiatives took place even before 1325 was adopted in 2000, and I would just like to highlight here the significant role of women peace builders in that country to resolving that conflict, but also of the way in which at the time New Zealand was able to support the women peace builders to actually increase their agency in the peace process. So New Zealand actually brought on 2 occasions a group of women peace builders to Christchurch, and sort of had confidential talks about that process, and was actively, supporting the way in which women were able to speak to armed parties, and to be attentive to the grievances on the ground. And I think that's a really, as you say, it's an underappreciated case. And I think it's also one that we need to keep an eye on right now, because Bougainville is looking at independence, and women peace builders continue their work, but also women continue to face some real structural barriers to their participation in the post-independence society and governance. So we need to not only focus on just resolving the conflict, but we also need to be continually supporting women's empowerment and agency in peace for the long haul, for the point of preventing the next, potential future conflicts. And there will be threats to that in Bougainville, especially in the context of the resources competition.
Yeah, I would just say that one of the reasons I love webinars is because I learn from them as well. You're right. Those are 2 cases which do not get really, I think, the attention they deserve in terms of positive lessons. We a lot of times look at instances of what didn't work, Northern Ireland, and the things that were done that were positive, but then there was the slide back, and there is very often a sliding back. But yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think I need to look into them more.
This is a great discussion, and unfortunately, we're rounding at about 5 minutes left before the conclusion of this webinar. So I'm going to end with this final question from Monica Herrera, and I'll apologize to the group. There's been a lot of great questions that have come through the queue, but unfortunately, we just can't get to all of them. So for this last one, to both Joan and Jackie, from Monica Herrera, she's in the Indo-PACOM Office of Women, Peace and Security. We often see WPS conferences, webinars, and events primarily attended by people who already work on WPS, when really the people who need to be hearing these messages most are not in the room. So how do we get more traditional security practitioners more actively engaged in WPS? And maybe Joan, if you want to start with this one.
Leadership, leadership, leadership. It's all about people pay attention to what their bosses want them to pay attention to, as indicated by what they pay attention to. And I think I was at a conference, a NATO conference, right before COVID shut down Italy last year. And it was hosted by a 4-star who insisted that his entire senior staff be there for the first morning presentations. And I'm sure that 90% of them had no idea what the topic was really about, but they came away at least knowledgeable of basics. And I had several of them tell me at the cocktail party later that they intended to look into it more. And I think this is often the case when people hear about or see for themselves the benefits of women, peace, and security efforts, they become believers. It's not hard to become a believer. It happens in my classes all the time, and I'm sure it does in other classes. So I think, again, right now we've been dependent on individual leaders knowing about it somehow, and therefore integrating it into their commands. But it needs to start at the top, and it needs to be made a priority and followed through as a priority. Not a one and done, not a let's do this and then it's forgotten, but made a priority with accountability.
Mm-hmm. I'd absolutely agree with that. And I think if we think about women, peace and security as a community of theory and practice, then it's also about all of us trying to engage with, you know, for example, if I'm a researcher, engaging with those who are working on the ground, whether that's in civil society or in a defense operation. And one of the ways that we try to make that community happen at Monash is we've convened a graduate certificate on gender, peace and security. And we have a number of scholarship candidates from Australian Defence Forces. And then those students then are also able to take gender, peace and security courses or content within the Defence College. And then they can kind of go on and train and teach others and spread it further. So I think, but having those connections between researchers and practitioners is really important, because we can be building the evidence and then they can be sharing the evidence and really, really spreading that at scale to those who need it to change their, to improve their practices. So I think that's really, really important. And, I think also I just want to have a shout out. There are some incredible defence leaders also in Australia. We've seen, key commitments to women, peace and security by our defence ministers, but also with the Gender, Peace and Security Directorate, which is really building its expertise. So I think, and the gender advisors, and Australia has more than 12 gender advisors, full-time gender advisors appointed to various operations. And I think that is making it real. And I think in the next decade, I'd really like to see that model, adopted in many of the countries in our region.
Perfect. Well, thank you to both. And just to kind of wrap up, that was definitely a very rich discussion. I was taking a bunch of notes and will probably be stealing, with credit to you both, of course, some of your lines in your paper, particularly about WPS being a thin margin of excellence, sustained peace and security, but also an inclusive agenda for bolstering capabilities and harnessing the intelligence and skills needed from all parts of the population. So thank you both again, and thank you for all of our participants with your very good and insightful questions, and our apologies that we couldn't get to all of that. So to wrap up, please stay tuned for the 5th session of the US-Australia Indo-Pacific Conversation Series happening in June. Registration announcements will be sent to email subscribers on Pacific Forum social media. And mahalo to all for joining today. And I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day, evening, and night. Aloha.